This is Kevin Martin coming to you from the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program. We recently wrapped up our 2018 Grape Growers Conference, and I discussed at the conference with, if you were there, with a bit of a lost voice, the differences between business organizations and how your business organization interacts with tax reform in 2018, as well as succession planning and estate planning, and all of the major concerns in that area surrounding business organizations. So basically, different ways businesses could organize to prepare themselves for those two major hurdles, and how the preparation may have changed with some tax reform. I did get a lot of questions about stepped-up basis, so I wanted to take a minute to address what stepped-up basis is and how it's obtained. So a lot of the value of our farms is passed from generation to generation through land. So most of the value of the farm is tied up in the land, and that income is not realized as a grower owns and operates a farm. And because it's not realized, how it's characterized is as a long-term capital gain. And the tax for that is calculated based on the purchase price of the property, sometimes in 1920, 30, 1940. And the sale price of the property, and the difference between those two is what's actually taxed. And for a lot of our growers, the difference is not really much different than the whole value of the property because such a long period of time has passed. But one way sort of around that calculation is inherited property receives what is called a stepped-up basis. So if you inherit property, the basis of the property for calculating a long-term capital gains is the value of that property when you inherited it. So the only tax is on the increase from the time of the inheritance to the time of the sale. So for the next generation, you really empower them to avoid quite a bit of long-term capital gains if you allow them to inherit that property. So if you were to sell your property or your farm to your son or daughter to finance your retirement, as those payments were made, those long-term capital gains would be realized and you'd be paying tax on those long-term capital gains. So that would be typically 15% on the federal level and an additional 3 to 6% on the state level. And it could go as high as 20% on the federal level, but theoretically it could also be lower, just depending on where your total income is at the time. So the only way to really avoid that is to pass the property through inheritance. And a straight-up inheritance works, which means the farmer has to retain the ownership of that property until the time of death. The only other thing that can be done is it can be placed in a revocable trust. So an LLC that owns the land, or the individual that owns the land, can place that property or the LLC itself inside of a revocable trust. And that trust does have to be revocable, which means the owner of the property technically still owns the property because the terms and beneficiaries can all change up until the time of death. So there's not a lot of certainty in this type of estate planning, which is one of the downsides. So it really does have to be worthwhile, and it has to be well thought out, and it has to be the right fit for the right type of estate. If you want a little more certainty, you'll probably be subject to capital gains, and it won't necessarily affect the sustainability of the farm, because those, like I said, those gains aren't realized. So this will just increase the taxes on the next generation when the sale of the property actually takes place. So that may be something that's actually worthwhile, but there were a number of growers interested in learning more about how stepped-up basis works and whether or not it's a tool that's available to them, and whether or not it's important. So those are sort of the limitations of what a stepped-up basis is, and sort of how it is very valuable, but only under those circumstances, and only really to the next generation. It's not necessarily a tax benefit for the senior generation. If you have any more questions from our recent conference, any of the speakers would be happy to address those questions through a podcast. Any questions about this topic or anything related to this topic, please address it in the comments below, and we'd be happy to hear from you. Thanks a lot for joining me.